I hope this is visible. Hello.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Fine. Hi. Today we'll be discussing about Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. As all of you know, it's has different names like Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, stress cardiomyopathy, apical ballooning, broken heart, and happy heart syndrome. And by definition, it is a clinical syndrome characterized by an acute and transient LV systolic dysfunction, often related to an emotional or a physical stressful event, most often identified in the preceding days. What they say the cutoff point is 1 to 5 days. This is according to Jack, and which is associated with regional wall motion abnormality, which is extending more than one coronary territory. And it is often divided into two major types or patterns, that is being major and minor forms of Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. And chiefly the diagnosis is based on the clinical context, ECG, echo, biomarkers, and imaging. This is in brief. And quickly moving on to the pathophysiology. Takotsubo cardiomyopathy is basically a disorder wherein there is abnormal regulation or abnormal synchrony between brain and the heart. And the proposed mechanisms are like there is a dysregulation or neocortex limbic integration is abnormal following stress, that is following a physical or a psychiatric stressful event. There is more and more output of norepinephrine from the neurons in the brainstem, and along with it there is this neuropeptide Y, which is a stress related peptide, and these are released from the limbic network. Limbic network, as all of us know, is concerned with the cognition, autonomic nervous system function, and insula, cingulate cortex, and hippocampus being its components. When they are activated by emotions or stressful event or a physical event, leads to increased production of norepinephrine and neuropeptide Y. And when these are produced in enormous quantities, there is a spillover at the postganglionic synaptic terminals of at the level of myocardium, and this has a direct toxic effect over the endothelium as well as the myocardium, leading to epicardial as well as myocardial dysfunction. And not only it is acting at the level of the myocardium, and there is spillover even into the systemic circulation, leading to its systemic effects. I'll come to this diagram later. And these are the proposed mechanisms for its systemic effects, that is the increased catecholamine levels in the systemic circulation. And this catecholamine levels have been found to influence heart via these 5 proposed mechanisms, like through the plaque rupture, multivessel epicardial spasm, microcirculatory dysfunction, catecholamine induced toxicity or catecholamine toxicity, cardiomyopathy, and activation of myocardial survival pathways. A quick brief of these 5 pathways, like as all of us know, the increased catecholamines in the blood or catecholamine surge or a storm leads to a plaque rupture, and which leads to thrombosis or total occlusion, which followed by activation of this thrombolysis mechanism, that is intrinsic plasmalogenic mechanism, lead to rapid lysis. And but because of this transient uh, ischemia, myocardium undergoes stunning, and whereas there is no epicardial coronary artery obstruction and coronary angiography. This was the first mechanism proposed, and the second mechanism being multivessel epicardial spasm. And this actually they thought that because of increased oxidative stress, there is endothelial dysfunction and there is abnormal vasomotor function, like as we see in some of the vascular diseases like migraine and Raynaud's. And they have proposed this as a mechanism for myocardial dysfunction, like what we see in the microvascular dysfunction or microvascular angina, what we commonly see. And the third mechanism being the microcirculatory dysfunction because of catecholamines. And these catecholamines and endothelin lead to vasoconstriction via the alpha-1 receptors and endothelin A receptors. And this has been proposed because they have found that although there is no epicardial obstruction, but they have found that there is microvascular dysfunction because of endothelial vasomotor abnormality. That is, there is endothelial dysfunction, and which has led to that may not be observed vasospasm as such, but because of the endothelial dysfunction, they have found more propensity for ischemia in patients with Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. And the fourth mechanism being catecholamine toxicity. Catecholamines as such have a direct toxic role on the cardiomyocytes. And as all of us know, the catecholamine activity on the cardiomyocyte via beta-1 and beta-2 receptors, depending upon its concentration, by acting through the beta-1 receptors, it can cause hypercontracted sarcomeres or contraction band necrosis by a cyclic AMP mediated calcium overload. And in the present via beta-2 pathway, in the presence of increased catecholamines, there could be a switching from the stimulatory G protein to inhibitory G protein pathway, leading on to increased nitric oxide synthase mechanism. And this increased nitric oxide synthase leads to peroxynitrate mediated nitrosative stress. Like that of the oxidative stress, there is this increased nitric oxide which is acting through this free radical pathway, leading to nitrosative stress and thus causing inflammation and negative inotropy or decreased contractility of the heart. And the fourth mechanism being when there is increased apoptotic pathway going on one side, and this apoptotic pathway also causes stimulation of anti-apoptotic pathway. That is, the survival mechanisms are also activated on one side. Hence, in many of the individuals with Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, it is usually, that is in 70 to 80% of the cases, whatever the myocardial dysfunction is usually reversible. And they have searched for the cause, like what exactly is responsible for this reversibility of the cardiac dysfunction in individuals. And they found that alongside the destructive mechanism, there is this protective mechanism which is also being activated, and these being through the beta-2 receptor as well as through the phosphoanatase 3 kinase pathway. How is the beta-2 receptor playing a role in protective mechanism as well? It is, as I told you, there is the switching of this stimulator to the inhibitory pathway. And when this is happening, the excessive beta-1 related hypercontractility or increased inotropy is antagonized by this switching of stimulator to the inhibitor pathway through the beta-2 receptor. And thus how it is actually causing negative inotropic effect, and it is actually limiting the amount of myocardial injury which is being caused by the beta-1 receptor. And the second kinase system, that is a protein kinase B pathway, it upregulates the anti-apoptotic transcription factors, and thus how it is actually protecting.
Huh?
Sorry, Arun,
mute your phone.
Yeah, he's muted, Amotika. Go on.
okay, fine. That's how it is playing a role to protect the myocardium from the injury from the catecholamines, like by activating the anti-apoptotic pathways. So this is what is being depicted in this diagram. So whenever there is increased stress, that is in the form of either physical or emotional stress, leads to increased the stimulation of the hypothalamus and the pituitary, as well as the limbic system, leading to increased catecholamines and neuropeptide Y, and which has direct as well as indirect effect on the myocardium. And thus how it is manifesting phenotypically as stress-induced cardiomyopathy or Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. So quickly moving on. So what exactly are the predisposition factors in an individual to develop Takotsubo cardiomyopathy? They are like, there is no definitive evidence that this is the thing which is making a person more susceptible to Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, but they have been proposed as possible mechanisms, and they have found in studies that hormonal causes, that is decreased estrogen in individuals with in the post-menopausal women, have been found to be one of the predisposing cause for the development of Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, because they have found that estrogen has a protective mechanism it protects the myocardium from the endothelial dysfunction. It is responsible for maintaining the endothelial normal milia. And when estrogen is decreased, there is more of endothelial dysfunction, and that's how the postmenopausal women are more susceptible for Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. And the genetic factors being, they have found that there is some familial clustering of the cases, but the possible gene associated with it has not been found. Hence, they've thought it could be a polygenic inheritance. And the incidence of Takotsubo was found to be higher in individuals with type D personality or anxiety or depression. And they have found an interesting finding, that is the microRNA 16 and 26A, which are usually associated with depression and anxiety, have been upregulated in individuals with the Takotsubo cardiomyopathy also. And hence, they found that it is commonly related to these disorders. And the incidence of Takotsubo is 15 to 30 cases per 1 lakh per year in US, and it is 1 to 2% of the suspected acute coronary syndromes, and it is most commonly seen in postmenopausal women because of the reasons I mentioned, that is increased catecholamines and neuropeptide Y, leading to endothelial dysfunction and decreased coronary reserve in this category of population. And they have found some interesting findings, that the emotional stress being a trigger in women, and the physical stress was found to be a trigger in men to cause Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. And these are the various triggers, emotional and physical. I think we can go through this. And moving on to the types, what are the phenotypic expressions of the disease per se? In majority of the cases, what we commonly see is the apical ballooning. I'll explain with the diagram. This is the one. The types are divided into major and minor, major being typical and atypical. And among the typical form of the disease is apical ballooning, seen in 70 to 80% of the cases. And it is usually associated with LVOTO and apical thrombus formation, and the prognosis in individuals with apical ballooning is usually variable. And the atypical forms being the midventricular, basal or inverted, and focal. These are the three common forms of major subtypes. And midventricular constituting to 10 to 20% of the cases, which is usually associated with severe LV dysfunction, and the patients can present with cardiogenic shock. And the third variety being the basal or inverted one, which constitutes 5% of the cases, and it is less commonly associated with hemodynamic compromise. Whereas the focal form is very difficult to diagnose clinically, because it can mimic myocarditis, but usually the focal form has a benign course, and it is more commonly associated with chest pain. One interesting finding which they have found is that in basal forms of Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, which is seen in less than 5% of the cases, it is commonly associated with pheochromocytoma and the neurological diseases like subarachnoid hemorrhage and stroke. And they also found that the atypical forms of Takotsubo were common in younger individuals with neurological comorbidities, and the association with BNP levels, they found that the BNP levels are less elevated in these individuals, and the EF could be normal or it could be less impaired. And the ECG changes which were associated with atypical forms were like the ST depression, but apical ballooning usually is associated with ST elevation, that I'll deal in this ECG part. And the minor types being the biventricular involvement, wherein the apical LV alone, along with the RV is involved, and isolated RV form. This RV involvement is very important because it actually dictates the prognosis in an individual with Takotsubo. And the global form, this particular entity is very difficult to actually group into Takotsubo, because there is always this entity is confused with that of tachycardiomyopathy. So or it could be even confused with idiopathic forms of DCM. So it is difficult to diagnose per se with echo. And RV, as I said, the RV involvement is seen in 1/3 of the cases, and it is a predictor of worse outcomes. Moving on to the predictors of death. I actually deal with this.
Mautika, why they are called major and minor types? Why
Based on
major?
the incidence.
Okay.
Yeah. That's it. And the predictors of the death, I'll deal with this in the next slides. Moving on to the clinical subtypes, they are again divided, classified Takotsubo into primary and secondary Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, depending upon its association with the clinical scenario. That is, in primary Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, the individuals per se presents with a cardiac ailment, that is usually majority of the cases are mistaken as ACS. And as I told you, 1 to 2% of the cases of ACS could have this Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. And these individuals have good prognosis. That is, the primary forms of Takotsubo have good prognosis, whereas in the secondary form of Takotsubo is seen in individuals who are critically ill, and it is an in-hospital diagnosis usually, and they present with deterioration of their actual clinical event in the form of arrhythmias, hypotension, acute pulmonary edema, or abnormal ECG or abnormal cardiac enzyme elevations. And for diagnosing a case of secondary Takotsubo, we require a high degree of suspicion. And usually, as these individuals are associated with multiple comorbidities, the prognosis as such in secondary Takotsubo is very poor. Moving on to the diagnosis of Takotsubo cardiomyopathy is usually these individuals present with chest pain or dyspnea. And the first investigation, what we usually see is the ECG, and there could be ST elevation, or there may not be ST elevation. And I just want to show you this typical patterns of ECG changes in Takotsubo. That is, they can present with ST elevation like that of an anti-wall MI, but to distinguish it from an anti-wall MI, the ECG characteristic findings in Takotsubo are like the ST elevations are seen in V2 to V5, whereas in acute anti-wall MI, it is seen from V1 to V4. And the second point is that the ST elevations are confined to lead 2 and AVR in Takotsubo, whereas they are usually seen in lead 1 and AVL. And the most important finding is that if at all you have a suspicion of Takotsubo in a patient with appearing to be having a ACS, if at all the patient is having ST depressions, the chances of being Takotsubo in patients with ST depressions is less. And what they have found in studies is that in patients with Takotsubo, the incidence of ST depression in precordial leads is around less than 8%. So, and even the ST elevation in inferior leads is also very uncommon. So, if any such pattern is seen, and you have a dilemma between ACS and Takotsubo, the points in favor of ACS are like ST depressions, and if at all the patient is having ST elevation in inferior leads, you can take them towards the ACS rather than considering them as Takotsubo. And once you have got the ECG, and if you have a greater suspicion of ACS, then you will subject the patient for coronary angiogram. And if you find a culprit lesion on a coronary angiogram, we can treat it as that of ACS. And if we don't find any epicardial coronary obstruction, then we have to rule out the infective causes like myocarditis in these individuals. We have to look for the red flag signs of myocarditis, and like we have to look for the ESR, CRP, and pericardial effusion. If there is any red flag sign suggestive of myocarditis, we have to subject such patients for cardiac MR directly. And if the cardiac MR, we can at least come to the diagnosis of either ACS or infection or myocarditis, because usually in individuals with Takotsubo, there won't be late gadolinium enhancement, and there is presence of edema. The absence of late gadolinium enhancement is more specific for Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. But there are few rare forms like in pheochromocytoma where they can have some patchy, subtle fibrosis. But as such, in patients with Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, there won't be late gadolinium enhancement. If at all we are finding late gadolinium enhancement, your diagnosis should be towards ACS or it should be towards the myocarditis. And based on this algorithm, once if at all you have come to a diagnosis of Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, then we have to actually, there are a few points which help to clinically predict the diagnosis. They are like the Mayo Clinic diagnostic criteria, the Italian network criteria, ESC Heart Failure Association Task Force criteria, and INTERTAC registry. The most commonly followed diagnostic criteria is the INTERTAC registries criteria, wherein they have taken into consideration Hello? Hello?
Yeah, Mautika,
Hello.
now we can hear
Sorry,
you. No problem.
Gautam told me that there was some issue with my audio, so I have to log out and again log in.
Yeah,
Now,
you
is
have
it audible? Like,
yeah, just start your screen share. I think it got cut off when you were talking about the INTERTAC registry and the diagnostic.
oh, okay, okay,
You had
sorry,
just
sorry.
started on that when it got cut. So,
Okay, fine. Okay, yeah. So, a few diagnostic criteria. Am I audible now?
yeah, but screen is not visible.
How come now?
Share the screen again. Share.
Wait, just 1 second. Is it visible now?
Yeah, visible.
Yeah. Thank you, Gautam. Yeah. Sorry for the interruption. The thing is, a few diagnostic criteria have been proposed, like the Mayo Clinic criteria, Italian network, and ESC task force criteria, and INTERTAC registry. Among these, the INTERTAC registry is commonly used, and they have taken into consideration mainly the post-menopausal women, transient wall motion abnormalities, and the triggers in the form of either emotional or neurological. And the one important thing that we have to remember here, when compared to the other three criteria, the INTERTAC registry, they didn't rule out the presence of coronary artery disease. That is, presence of coronary artery disease is not against the diagnosis of Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. because according to them, a bystander coronary artery disease may be present in individuals with Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. And presence of a epicardial obstruction or a CAD does not rule out Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, is what they say. And typical ECG abnormalities, which I mentioned, and also what they say is in the ECG abnormalities, the other, along with ST wave changes, the other important finding that we have to look for is the QT prolongation according to this diagnostic criteria. And why this is important is the patients with a QT prolongation of more than 500, there is higher chance of VT. So they have taken that into a consideration. And the cardiac biomarkers, what they have found is that there is a disparity between the raise in troponins and the NT-proBNP. And according to this, they say that the amount of NT-proBNP elevation or the elevation is high when compared to the amount of dysfunctional myocardium. The troponin elevation is not that significant. That's what they say. And the two things which they have not considered in INTERTAC registry but has been considered in Mayo Clinic and Italian Network registry is that the presence of pheochromocytoma. For INTERTAC registry, the pheochromocytoma is not taken into consideration either to rule out or rule in a Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. So these are the brief diagnostic criteria which has been proposed, and there is this diagnostic score which I wanna mention here, that this is also an INTERTAC diagnostic score. A score of more than 70 points, there is a high probability that a patient might have Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, and it is based on these individual parameters like female sex, emotional stress, physical stress, no ST depression, psychiatric disorders, neurological disorders, and QT prolongation. So these were the parameters, 7 parameters which have been given individual points, and if the individual qualifies to a point score of more than 70, it has a very high probability of Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. So moving on. Apart from the ECG parameters which I have mentioned, there are some other few parameters. That is, what are the specific indicators in delayed presentation? Like, if at all we are not seeing ST elevations or ST depressions, and they say that QT inversion and QT prolongation is also a footprint of Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. And patients very rarely can have low voltage complexes, and it signifies that there is presence of significant myocardial edema. So I just want to skip this because I've told you these are the biomarkers. I think you can read about this. And so what are the echo parameters which are important for us? They are like the presence of symmetric regional wall motion abnormality involving more than one coronary artery distribution. And the one thing which is important in echo is that the speckle tracking echo. In speckle tracking echo, the presence of circular motion is what they say is characteristic feature of Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. And the echo also differentiates different variants of Takotsubo, and in apical form, there is in 2D speckle tracking, the LV twisting decreases or it is reversed to clockwise rotation, whereas in normal LV, there is an anti-clockwise twisting or anti-clockwise rotation. And the rate of untwisting is also decreased. These are the two parameters which you have to see in 2D speckle tracking imaging. Whereas in the mid form of or mid ventricular form of Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, it usually resembles as a cuff and 2D echo. Whereas in focal form, as I told you, it has to be differentiated from the myocarditis, and hence cardiac MR is a good investigation of choice when you are dealing with the focal form. And one thing I want to emphasize here is the wall motion score index. What they say is if the patient is having a wall motion score index of more than 1.75 with more than 4 segments involved, is diagnostic of Takotsubo with a specificity of 100% and a sensitivity of 84%. In individuals like in the secondary form of Takotsubo, where coronary angiogram is high risk, we can go ahead with contrast echo, and we'll see there is a decreased opacification in dysfunctional segment with transmural defects.
Mautika,
Yeah, Varshit.
this wall motion score index more than 1.75
Yeah.
and what you told, like it can be also there in ACS also, no? The same things can be there now in the interval MI or any acute coronary syndromes.
Yeah, but
Because you are telling
they have,
specificity of 100%, so that means high positive predictive value, no?
yeah, you can diagnose it for sure that it is a case of Takotsubo. Yeah.
But
Because the main point here, what they want to specify is that whatever the regional wall motion we are seeing here is it is not localized to one coronary artery distribution, basically.
that is okay. That
It
I
is,
agree. But the wall motion score index and more than 4 segments involved, that is not specified. No, which same coronary segment or different segment, that is not specified. No.
yeah, but this is what they have given in JACC. And that I understood that because of, I thought it is a correlation with the number of coronary artery distribution. Like it is going for more than one coronary artery distribution, hence it could be significant.
Okay.
Yeah, again, I'll just go through that and I'll get back.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Fine. If anybody has come across like, because this is what I understood from that, like if at all any explanations for this possible. Hello. Hello.
Yeah, Mautika, you go ahead.
Okay,
We'll see.
fine. Okay, fine. And other parameters like the coronary flow reserve, they found that the coronary flow reserve has decreased to 1.6 to 2.6, and there is no improvement in contractility with dobutamine stress echo, because this is one thing which we have to remember when, if at all we are suspecting that it could be possible ischemic etiology. Usually, if at all it is ischemic origin of wall motion abnormality, and if there is viable myocardium with dobutamine stress echo, there will be improvement in the contractility, but such a thing is not seen in patients with Takotsubo. And whatever the shortening with dobutamine stress echo, what we see in STEMI, or following MI, it is a longitudinal shortening of viable myocardium, whereas in Takotsubo, they found it is because of passive motion, there is systolic lengthening. And this is a very good parameter because they have found that on follow-up, whatever the systolic lengthening has resolved. That's one thing we have to remember. And the other things which we can see in echo are the complications of Takotsubo, like LVOTO and presence or absence of MR. Because the incidence of MR in patients with Takotsubo, they found it to be around 25%, and it is, as all of us as known, it is because of the papillary muscle dysfunction. And what is the role of CT-CAG? It has a major role in individuals with the secondary Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, because these individuals are at high risk for invasive coronary angiogram. And they are like the people with the terminal malignancy, intracerebral hemorrhage, advanced stage frailty, and bleeding diathesis, which are the contraindications for invasive coronary angiogram, have to be subjected to CT-CAG. Mainly to look for the coronary anatomy and the LV function. And as I told, these are the things which we can see in cardiac MR, that is the presence or absence of late gadolinium enhancement, and presence of fibrosis, and the volumes and function of the ventricles, both RV as well as LV. And this is something which I want to take a minute or two on. This is the cardiac nuclear imaging. The cardiac nuclear imaging, basically they have looked at the perfusion, metabolism, and the innervation. As all of us know, the SPECT is a semi-quantitative and PET is a quantitative imaging. What they have found is that in Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, the perfusion nuclear imaging was normal, whereas the metabolism and innervation studies have showed decreased or impaired in the regions of wall motion abnormality. This is what they have found in Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. And moving on to the differential diagnosis. These were the 3 differentials which we have to consider before going to Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. They are like ACS, that is a myocardial infarction, myocarditis, and pheochromocytoma. why pheochromocytoma is important is that it has a therapeutic role here, because when we are treating a patient with Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, giving a beta blocker without ruling out pheochromocytoma actually worsens the situation. So it is always imperative that we have to rule out pheochromocytoma, especially in individuals with LVOTO, when we are considering beta blockers to improve the cardiac output. This is one thing it has to be remembered. And the second thing is that the pheochromocytoma can present with lymphocytic myocarditis as a small focal areas or focal form of Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. So hence, again, we have to rule out this form of cardiomyopathy before actually attributing it as truly Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. And others being the myocardial infarction, myocarditis, and these parameters I think you can study. And moving on to the complications and the outcomes. As I said, the clinical presentation is no different from that of ACS, and it commonly, the one good predictor is that it's commonly seen in postmenopausal women and almost is associated with the stressor event. These two things actually helps you to take the diagnosis to Takotsubo, and it could be associated with the chest pain, shortness of breath, dizziness, and syncope, and these were the various percentages attributed. And on examination, we'll have all the signs and symptoms of cardiac failure or raised filling pressures. And these were the in-hospital complications seen with Takotsubo, and the frequent complications seen were like the acute heart failure seen in 45% of the cases, and the LVOTO, that is LVOT obstruction, seen in 25% of the cases, commonly seen in apical ballooning or typical form of Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. And the incidence of MR they found was in 25%, and cardiogenic shock is in 20% of the patients. And other most common complication, that is arrhythmias, we have to keep in mind, and it is in 25% of the cases of Takotsubo, and the most common form of arrhythmia being atrial fibrillation. And VT, that is Torsades, is common in individuals with QTc more than 500 milliseconds. Rare forms of complications being free wall rupture or mechanical complications can be seen, but the incidence of these complications was found to be less than 5%. And what are the predictors of clinical outcome in a patients with Takotsubo cardiomyopathy? They are mainly like age more than 75 years, EF less than 35%, presence of severe mitral valve regurgitation, presence of RV involvement, which is seen in nearly 1/3 of the cases, and presence of AF, presence of free wall rupture or the mechanical complications, and presence of LVOTO, cardiogenic shock, QT prolongation, and arrhythmias, and presence of a neurological trigger or a physical trigger, that is a secondary form of Takotsubo, and this in the atypical forms, the neurological trigger was found to have unfavorable prognosis. This was the outcome studied at the end of 5 years, and what they have found is that this was in comparison with that of the ACS. So the outcomes in patients with Takotsubo are as bad as in patients with acute coronary syndrome. That's what it says. And quickly moving on to the management, this is again divided into pre-hospital setting, acute setting, and post-discharge setting. In the pre-hospital setting, we have to address the arrhythmias, cardiac arrest, and of course, the cardiogenic shock, the preliminary resuscitation measures have to be taken care of, followed by the acute treatment. In the acute management, the patients, based on their presentation, that is whether they are in the acute pulmonary congestion or in the cardiogenic shock, the management differs, because in cardiogenic shock, that is usually these individuals are associated with low cardiac output, and we have to diagnose, or we have to look for the presence or absence of LVOTO, which actually dictates the treatment in these individuals, because the presence of LVOT obstruction is a contraindication for the inotropes, and they have to be treated with beta blockers and IV fluids, that is by increasing preload and afterload. And as I told you, you have to rule out presence of pheochromocytoma before starting the patients on beta blockers. And peripherally acting vasopressors can be given whenever it is needed, just only to increase the afterload. And they proposed the vasopressors like phenylephrine and vasopressin can be given. The indicated beta blockers in the treatment of Takotsubo are propranolol, metoprolol, and esmolol. And what they say is it is always beneficial to give esmolol, that is a short-acting beta blocker, to have a rapid onset of action and rapid offset of action. Once we have ruled out the presence of LVOT obstruction, then we can treat a patient with Takotsubo as any other form of systolic heart failure, and they can be given inotropes, and the preferred inotropes in this case being milrinone, dobutamine, dopamine, and levosimendan. And if required, we can give phenylephrine. So moving to the second subset, that is patients presenting with pulmonary congestion where there is no low cardiac output. They have to be treated with venodilators, diuretics, and arterial vasodilators. So for the treatment of in the acute setting, for the treatment of a patient with Takotsubo, the one thing which we have to see is the presence or absence of LVOT obstruction, because it dictates the treatment protocol which we have to follow. That's what this table says. And moving on to the complications, being like other complications like ventricular arrhythmias and ventricular thrombosis. Like for ventricular arrhythmias, as usual, you have to look for the QTc and electrolyte imbalance, and we have to correct the underlying abnormality. And what is the role for this mechanical support devices, like circulatory support devices? It is advised that in patients with LVOTO, IABP is a contraindication. If at all you wanna give IABP for a patient who is critically ill and in pump failure, first you have to rule out LVOTO, and because IABP is associated with decreased afterload and worsening of the LVOT obstruction. But in the presence of LVOT obstruction, it is safe to give ECMO. That's what they say. And what is the role of ivabradine in patients with very severe LV dysfunction, but with the presence of tachycardia, where beta blockers cannot be given, we can try ivabradine in such individuals. That's what they say. And there is one registry known as Retaco registry. Actually, they have seen how the beta blockers are affecting the long-term mortality. That is, they have found that people who have been treated with beta blockers in an acute setting, the mortality at 1 year was found to be low. It is basically a registry based data. It's not a randomized control trial. And so after the management and the predictors which we have seen, like which actually predates the poor prognosis in these individuals. And what about the recurrence? Recurrence of Takotsubo cardiomyopathy is seen in around 5% of the cases, and it was found that there is a recurrence rate of 2 to 4% per year. And at 10 years, they have found a recurrence rate of 20%. And if at all the recurrence happens, it most commonly occurs during the 3 weeks to 4 years period following the incident event. And it affects both men and women equally. And one thing which I want to mention here, it is the preconditioning as that of the ischemic preconditioning. Here, it's an interesting finding that in individuals who had a recurrent event of Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, it was found that the segments involved in the second event were different from that of the index event. That is, what they say is the index Takotsubo event has provided some protection to the regions, and thus how there is involvement of different segments in the second event. That's what has been found. And even the triggers may be different, and the pattern of involvement, for example, say the first index event was apical ballooning, the second event could be a mid-ventricular, or it could be even basal pattern. So it need not present as the same as the index event. That's what I want to say. And as previously thought that Takotsubo is a disease commonly seen in postmenopausal women, but it has been found that it is also seen in individuals who are less than 60 years. But this is an entity that is a stress cardiomyopathy in young individuals. The incidence of this is, that is in individuals less than 60 years is less than 10% in less than 55 years of age and less than 2% in less than 35 years of age. And they have found that there is a strong psychiatric disorder being schizophrenia or anorexia nervosa are being found as comorbidities in these individuals. And the major triggers for this being pregnancy, medications like catecholamines or anesthetics, and drug abuse, mainly amphetamines. And the anatomical pattern, more often, as I told you, in young individuals presenting with Takotsubo, it is usually the atypical forms which are common. And the basal or the inverted form is commonly seen in those individuals, followed by mid-ventricular form. And the prognosis is that they have poor prognosis. I mean, the prognosis is not that great as that we see in classical forms. And there is a high risk of arrhythmias and hemodynamic instability. And there is a greater propensity for recurrence. So I just want to tell one point, that is, what is the role of ICD or CRT in these individuals with the Takotsubo? What they say is we can consider them for a VEST, that is a wearable ICD, and there is no studies or there is no evidence to take these patients for early ICD placement, because the majority of these individuals, the EF improves over a period of time. That's what they mentioned. I think that's it. Hello? 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 Again, my voice is lost or what?
It's audible. It is audible, Monica.
Okay, okay, fine.
Shall I start?
Varshit, yeah, Varshit, I'll go through that thing again and I'll get back because this is what I got from the articles which I've studied, and yeah, I'll go through that and I'll again get back to this point, the wall motion score index. If nothing, then I'll stop sharing them.
My screen is visible.
Yeah.
Hello? Screen is visible, right? Hello?
Yeah, Praveen.
Varun? I mean, you're audible also, right? I'll start now.
Yeah, it is audible.
Okay. So going into HIV and the heart. So in the recent times, because of the increased potency and the increased because of the newer drugs in the ART regimens, it has been found that the HIV-related mortality per se has decreased. So more and more HIV patients are living till their older ages. So because of which so many age-related comorbidities like cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, kidney diseases, osteoporosis, and cancers are contributing more and more to the HIV-related morbidity and mortality. So per se, non-HIV-related deaths are increasing in HIV patients. So this makes cardiovascular disease as an important contributor of mortality and morbidity in this cohort of HIV patients. So overall, 6.5 to 15% of the deaths in HIV patients are due to cardiovascular diseases. And there are many contributing factors to this, namely the metabolic issues, immune activation, chronic inflammation, microbial translocation, co-infection with viruses like CMV, and side effects of ART per se. So cardiovascular risk factors in HIV, the traditional risk factors are more common in HIV patients comparatively, like dyslipidemia, metabolic syndrome, smoking, and hypertension, leading to a higher 10-year Framingham risk scores. Going into lipid abnormalities, they are present since early stages of HIV infection. The commonly found lipid abnormalities are decrease in HDL, decrease in LDL, and increased in triglycerides. And among the LDL, the small dense fragments of LDL are found to be increased more. And post ART, especially with the protease inhibitors, it leads to increase in total cholesterol and LDL levels and decrease in HDL levels. And it also, I mean, overall the lipid profile, it's altered to be more atherogenic. And the most common lipid abnormality found in this cohort of patients is increased triglycerides, and most ART drugs also cause increase in LDL levels. The most potent increase in hypertriglyceridemia is caused by ritonavir, to the tune that in some patient it can increase the triglycerides to even to more than 1000 milligrams per deciliter. And the ritonavir saquinavir combination and ritonavir and lopinavir combination are one of the most commonly used regimens, and they also contribute to an increased triglycerides. So atazanavir is a very it has a lesser effect on triglyceride levels, and newer drugs like raltegravir and maraviroc, vicraviroc, etc. are there. They have a more favorable effects. And tenofovir, actually in the recent times, the salt of tenofovir has been changed. The older salt was tenofovir disoproxyl fumarate, but in the recent times it has been changed to alafenamide. So this newer formulation is actually associated with an increased total cholesterol, increased HDL, and increased LDL. But overall, because it's increasing both the total cholesterol and HDL, the total cholesterol by HDL ratio remains unchanged. The next in line is the lipodystrophy and metabolic syndrome. Lipodystrophy refers to fat accumulation in dorsocervical region, along with an increase or rather a preservation of visceral fat, along with the loss of fat in the periphery and subcutaneum. And this overall leads to a central adiposity. This can occur in 20 to 35% of patients after ART, especially in patients taking protease inhibitors and NRTs like stavudine and diadenosine. And atazanavir has been found not to induce any lipodystrophy. And this lipodystrophy is usually associated with features of metabolic syndrome, the prevalence of which from various studies is between 8.5 to 52%. And overall, the lipodystrophy and metabolic syndrome contribute to an increased cardiovascular risk profile, increased MI, and increased acute coronary syndrome in the HIV patient. Going into diabetes, the direct relation to HIV, whether HIV directly causes an increased incidence of diabetes is controversial because different studies show differently. It has more to do with the ART regimens. The most commonly used drugs which causes diabetes are indinavir, ritonavir, lopinavir combination, stavudine, and diadenosine. And some of because as I already told, some studies disprove a direct association between diabetes and HIV. And factors other than this which contribute to diabetes mellitus are also the increased inflammation, worsening of HIV per se, and hepatitis C, co-infection, and autoimmune disease in older age. So smoking also, as we have seen, compared to non-HIV patients, HIV patients are found to be smokers. More than 50% of HIV patients are current smokers, and they have increased mortality. Whatever may be the cause of death, overall the all-cause mortality is more in them. And the population attributable risk of death associated with smoking is 61.5%. compared to 34.2% in controls. And smoking cessation is strongly advised, and smoking cessation has been shown to decrease the cardiovascular risk. But the interaction between anti-smoking drugs and ART drug interactions are not known. And comparatively, hypertension and CKD are more prevalent in HIV patients, and both increasing the MI risk in these patients. CKD is especially increased among patients taking tenofovir and atazanavir ritonavir combination and lopinavir ritonavir combination. Both the CKD and hypertension lead to an increase in the cardiovascular risk events in these patients. And going into atherosclerosis, even low-level transcription of HIV genes may contribute to atherosclerosis. This is even after the ART. I mean, even when the patient has been started on ART and it has been continued for a long time, even then it has been found that there will be a low-level transcription of HIV genes going on, which directly contributes to an increased atherosclerosis in this cohort of patients. And certain HIV-encoded proteins like the transactivator of transcription protein and the negative factor protein has been found to increase the inflammation and increase endothelial dysfunction. Both of this directly contributes to atherosclerosis. And another one more HIV envelope protein, namely the GP120, has been found to increase the endothelin 1 levels. And the protease in the ART drugs also contribute variably to the increased atherosclerosis, which has been found in HIV patients. But the mechanism of action which is being contributed by the different class of drugs are actually different. Namely, the protease inhibitor contribute to atherosclerosis by increasing the reactive oxygen species and endothelial apoptosis, and NRTAs contribute by increasing the platelet reactivity, and NNRTAs contribute by increasing the monocyte adhesion to endothelium. And because of the chronic inflammation and increased T cell activation, they also directly contribute to atherosclerosis. So we see that actually both HIV per se and the treatment of HIV both in a way contribute to the increased atherosclerosis seen in HIV patients. And it has also been found that the overall T cell numbers are more in HIV patient, contributing to increased interleukin 6, increased D dimer, and increased C-reactive protein levels. And one study, namely the SMART study, has shown that these inflammatory markers and coagulation factors which are increased in HIV patients are independent predictors of cardiovascular events. And it has also been shown that monocytes and macrophages activation play a critical role in the causing atherosclerosis in HIV patients, and activated monocytes lead to accelerated carotid atherosclerosis, and it has also been shown to have increased coronary calcium when there is activated monocytes in HIV patient. And monocytes and macrophages activation has also been shown to be associated with increased aortic inflammation, and it has been repeatedly proven in PET studies that aortic inflammation correlated with increased levels of CD163, which in turn is an it is a marker for activation of monocytes and macrophages. And overall in HIV patient, the monocyte phenotype is found to be procoagulant phenotype, and CD4 count nadir has been shown to be directly proportional to the subclinical carotid atherosclerosis. Means whenever the lower CD4 count directly correlates with increased cardiovascular disease risk, increased carotid plaques, and increased arterial stiffness. But this concept that the lower CD4 counts contribute to atherosclerosis has been questioned by some recent studies, namely the DAD study, which has not shown any correlation between the low CD4 count and the increased cardiovascular disease risk among HIV patients. But some studies have also shown that ART can restore endothelial function, but it has been shown that the endothelial function is not restored fully, and various studies shows varying degrees of endothelial function improvement with ART. And so overall, because of the increased inflammation and increased ROS, the overall inflammatory profile of the patients are altered towards an inflammatory milieu, wherein the pro-inflammatory markers are increased in the blood, namely the von Willebrand factor ICAM1, VCAM1, and the R2 receptor TNF, and the CMV specific T cell responses all have been shown to increase, to be increased in HIV patients. And all these markers are also shown to be contributing to non-AIDS related deaths, and also to cardiovascular deaths and all-cause mortality. And it has been shown that ST2, growth differentiation factor 15, NT-proBNP levels are also useful in predicting mortality in HIV patients. And it has also been shown that increased microbial translocation is present in patients with HIV, and which in turn can contribute to atherosclerosis by producing increased lipopolysaccharides in the blood. But some studies have actually studied to target this microbial translocation with either rifaximin or sevelamer, but these studies have failed to show any specific benefit of preventing the microbial translocation. And it has also been shown that monocyte response marker, namely CD14, has been shown to be a predictor of mortality in these patients. And compared to other atherosclerosis, it has been found that certain features of HIV-related atherosclerosis are unique pathologically, Namely, it more often resembles a transplant vasculopathy, showing a diffuse circumferential vessel involvement with the smooth muscle cell proliferation mixed with abundant elastic fibers. And the internal elastic lamina has also been found to be frequently calcified in these patients. And CTCAC coronary artery scores have not been found to be higher than controls. Studies have shown that the CTCAC scores are actually almost equal to the controls who are not infected with HIV. But it has also been found that compared to a non-HIV patients, HIV patients have an increased prevalence of non-calcified plaques. And by non-calcified plaques, we mean which are which have an increased lipid burden and which have inflammatory and which are more prone to rupture, contributing to an increased prevalence of acute coronary syndromes in these patients. And carotid plaque are also found to be more common in HIV patients. And the carotid intima medial thickness has been found to be an independent mortality predictor. So going into coronary artery disease per se, coronary artery diseases are increased to the tune of 1.5 to 2 times than non-HIV patients. And because of the increased CAD, the MI risk is also more, contributing to an increased prevalence of ACS and MI. And it has been shown that with each passing decade in the age of the patient, the risk of MI progressively increases. And it has also been found that even in well-treated patients, means the patients who are prescribed ART and whose viral loads has been sufficiently controlled, even in that patient, it has been found to, even those patients are found to have an increased CAD and MI compared to a non-HIV infected patients. So we can't consider that since because we have started ART and viremia has been controlled, it is not a foolproof method that atherosclerosis can be controlled. So the increased risk of atherosclerosis, even probably the magnitude might be less, but the risk is definitely there even in virally suppressed patients. And the risk is actually comparable to traditional risk factors like hypertension, smoking, and diabetes, etc. And as you have seen, there is also increased risk of ischemic stroke, and both due to the direct HIV effect and both because of the treatment, drug-related effects might have cause an increase in ischemic strokes. And it has also been found that more the ART duration, it has been found that it is associated with an increased cardiovascular events. But actually, they have compared regimens of continuous ART with regimens of intermittent ART. It has been found that intermittent ART has been found to have an increased cardiovascular risk events compared to a continuous ART. It has been proposed that this might be due to the fact that HIV, because HIV has a direct effect of causing atherosclerosis and increasing the CV risk events. So giving a continuous ART will keep the HIV and the viral loads at check, and that direct contribution to atherosclerosis might be decreased by continuous ART rather than an intermittent ART. And it has also been found that various drugs variably contribute to the CAD risk, namely intinavir, lopinavir, ritonavir combination, diadenosine, and abacavir. And abacavir actually there is some controversy regarding whether abacavir directly increases the CAD risk, but one of the main studies, namely the DAT study, has actually shown that whenever abacavir regimens were used, it was associated with a 90% increase in MI. The proposed mechanisms of abacavir increasing the CAD risks are due to increased platelet hyperreactivity and endothelial dysfunction, leukocyte, and by increasing the interaction between the endothelium and the leukocytes. And atazanavir has been shown to increase the bilirubin levels, but it has also been shown to increase the intimal medial thickness progression compared to other drugs. And some presentation wise also, CAD, MI, HIV related CAD are a bit different from our conventional CAD. Namely, the patients who present with CAD and MI-ACS are actually a decade younger than conventional ACS patients, and they are more likely to be male, and they are also more likely to be current smokers and are associated with decreased HDL levels. And overall, single vessel disease is more common than other cohorts of MI patients. In HIV-related MI, it's more often a single vessel disease, and all the risk scores are found to have, they have a lower risk scores. So, and the type 2 MI is more common, and some studies have shown up to 40% of MI occurring in HIV patients might be type 2 rather than type 1 MI. And because of all these factors, it is often associated with an excellent intermediate outcomes, but long-term outcome studies are not yet available now. And treatment of ACS wise, earlier studies with bare metal stents found that because of the increased in CD8 and increased CRP levels, HIV patients were found to have an increased instant restenosis. But the latest studies with the drug-eluting stents have found that the intermediate term results are actually similar, and no particular adverse events with post-PCI has been found. And in surgery cohorts also, it has been found that including CABG patients, the in-hospital mortality is almost the same as non-HIV patients. But usually these are associated with increased transfusion and increased post-op complications. And per se, HIV patients with ACS are actually found to have decreased investigation and decreased CAGs compared to a non-HIV patients. And as we have seen, HIV patients usually have an increased risk of ischemic strokes. And like an MI, these ischemic stroke patients are also found to be younger than conventional stroke patients, and they are also more common in males. And treatment wise, all these ACS, CAD, all these treatments actually are to be treated just like non-HIV patients, because no particular study or no particular registry have looked into any difference in treatment of CAD in HIV patients compared to non-HIV patients. So depending on the presentation, whether it is STEMI, NSTEMI or chronic stable angina, only the non-HIV related guidelines apply to the HIV patients also. But two things which are different from others are the effect of ART on the cardiovascular system and the treatment of hyperlipidemia in these patients because of the interaction between commonly used statins and the ART. Going into the ART related risk factors, treatment protocol have actually changed because the efficacy of ART and the adverse drug reactions of, efficacy of ART has increased and adverse drug reactions of ART has decreased over the last few years. So even all this treatment of HIV started, initially only the high risk patients were used to be treated for the fear of adverse drug reaction and decreased efficacy. But nowadays, all patients are being treated irrespective of the CD4 counts. So the main aim of ART is they are to be started as soon as possible whenever the diagnosis is made. And if possible, it has to be started before HIV antibody test positivity occurs. At that stage, if ART is started, it has been found to decrease the size of latent HIV reservoir, decrease the immune activation, and decrease the infection of central memory T cells. And it has also been found that various regimens wherein the patients will be prescribed for ART for a particular period of time. And once the patient have a decreased or a negative viremia after a particular period of time, some regimens were actually advised wherein the ART will be withdrawn. But such planned discontinuation regimens are actually not recommended as of now. Even in those patients who are called as elite controllers, wherein the viremia is, the effect of the drug on viremia is so good, and the viremia has been repeatedly found to be, the viremia load has been found to be nil. Even in that sort of patients, the planned discontinuation is doubtful presently. So there are some regimens which are mentioned in Braunwald regarding the starting of ART. What is different is basically compared to earlier time, recently integrase inhibitors have been added as the first line drug regimens presently, because they are highly effective and they have more rapid virological suppression and they are extremely well tolerated. I have added some combinations. The usual combos I have added, but actually you can go through these combinations. It has been found that 96% of these combinations have undetectable plasma HIV RNA levels. And actually, with respect to abacavir, the HLA B star 5701 allele is very important. It has also, because it is often associated with almost 50% of patients with this allele has been found to have a hypersensitivity reaction to abacavir, which may be life-threatening. For this reason, abacavir, I mean, if this HLA phenotyping has to be done in all patients who are planned for abacavir, and in case if it is found to be positive, then abacavir should not be given in these patients. And as we have seen, abacavir also can increase the CV risk events by increasing the CAD. So that has also to be considered when starting abacavir related regimens. And in case if the patient is not affordable for integrase inhibitor regimens, or if the availability of drug is not there, then non-integrase inhibitor regimens are also has been proposed. And each, I mean, the three commonly used non-integrase inhibitor regimens I have mentioned, we need not know the full details of these regimens. We can just know that the integrase inhibitors are a first line now, and in those, if it is not affordable or not available, then non-integrase inhibitor regimens are also there. But one particular thing is that this rilpivirine with tenofovir and emtricitabine, this regimen has been found to have a lesser metabolic side effects compared to other regimens. And HIV per se can be associated with increased osteoporosis and increased risk of fractures. And ART has also been found to increase the bone loss. So whenever, actually particularly tenofovir is associated with the increased risk of bone loss. So it is not actually recommended for any patients with osteopenia or osteoporosis. And as we have seen, tenofovir is also associated with an increased risk of CKDs. So whenever the estimated GFR is less than 60 ml per minute, tenofovir should not be given. And going into the other spectrum of treatment of hyperlipidemia, as we have seen, the drug interaction between the commonly used regimens of of the statins, anti-lipid drugs, and ART drugs are very common. So actually, it has been found that both protease inhibitors and NNRTAs can affect the cytochrome P450 system. So all protease inhibitors are found to have an inhibitory effect on CYP3A4, leading to an increase in levels of ARTs. So the maximum effect of inhibition of cytochrome oxidase system is the ritonavir, followed by indinavir, nelfinavir, amprinavir, and saquinavir. And delavirdine, which is an NNRTA, has also been found to have a suppressive effect on CYP3A4. And nevirapine and efavirenz are found to actually induce the CYP3A4. So all these drug interactions has to be borne in mind when combining lipid lowering drugs along with the protease inhibitors and NNRTAs. And among the statins, it has been found that simvastatin and lovastatin, when combined with protease inhibitors, are found to have a maximum effect on increasing the levels of protease inhibitors. So because of the fear of rhabdomyolysis, both simvastatin and lovastatin are contraindicated in combination with protease inhibitors. And atorvastatin also increases the levels of protease inhibitors, but actually the level of atorvastatin rise when given along with protease inhibitor is to a lesser extent. Pravastatin and fluvastatin have been found to be safe, but the LDL lowering effect of these drugs are modest when compared to simvastatin or atorvastatin. And rosuvastatin, because of the drug interaction, it has been advised to limit the dosage of rosuvastatin to only 10 milligrams per day. And as usual, diet and exercise regimens are to be followed as in non-HIV patients. And the first option, statin, in patients who are already taking protease inhibitor or delavirdine, is pravastatin and an atorvastatin, and a reasonable second option is fluvastatin. And those patients who are not taking ART, which directly affects the cytochrome system, it has been advised to go along with the guidelines and prescribe high intensity statins accordingly. And treatment, as we have seen, various factors contribute to the hypertriglyceridemia in HIV patients, which can be treated with fibrates if the triglyceride levels are more than 500 milligrams per deciliter. And niacin and the bile acid sequestrants are not recommended in HIV patients, and ezetimibe has been found to be safe. And because of the PCSK9 inhibitors, as you know, because of their new class of drugs, there are not so much available data, but it has been proposed that for now it has not been found to be having any adverse effects in combination with ART, so they can also be used. And there is also this concern that compared to non-HIV patients, the degree of reduction in in LDL by statins might not be that much as in non-HIV patients, meaning that the degree of LDL reduction by statin is found to have when it decreases the LDL to a lesser extent in HIV patient. And because statins are also found to have anti-inflammatory effects, it has also been shown that various inflammatory markers are also decreased by statins. And here again, compared to a non-HIV patients, in HIV patients, the degree of lowering of inflammatory markers are lesser with statins. And as we have seen, HIV patients are found to have an increased prevalence of non-calcified plaques. So atorvastatin has been found in various studies to decrease this non-calcified plaques. So overall, this is the HIV and the CAD. So something about pulmonary hypertension. The prevalence of pulmonary hypertension is in HIV has been found to be 0.5%, and it is not changed by, or it is not either decreased or increased by ART regimens. But it has also been found recently that the true prevalence may be higher than 0.5%. So the pathology wise, it is same as non-HIV patient, wherein the intima gets thickened and there are plexogenic lesions in the media leading to small pulmonary artery obstructions. And because of the pulmonary hypertension, it has also been found that this pulmonary hypertension contributes to increased dyspnea, RV failure, decrease in exercise capacity, and increase in sudden cardiac deaths in this patient. And it has also been found that once pulmonary hypertension develops, the survival is only 6 months. So it also contributes to earlier deaths in this cohort of patients. But in the recent studies, it has been found that the contribution, the survival may be increased. I mean, the survival may be better for more than 6 months. And cardiac index of more than 2.8 liters per minute per meter square, and CD4 counts of more than 200 cells per microliter has been found to contribute to survival. And pulmonary hypertension patients in HIV, if they have pulmonary hypertension, then most of these patients cause of death will be either directly or indirectly related to pulmonary hypertension only, rather than being contributed by any other factors. So it has been found that various markers of inflammation are also increased in these pulmonary hypertension patient, namely the VEGF-A and platelet-derived growth factors in interleukin 1 and interleukin 6. And as we have already seen, GP120 has been directly implemented to cause an increased endothelin 1 levels, and these endothelial 1 levels has been found to play a central role in contributing to the increased prevalence of pulmonary hypertension in HIV patient. And there is something called as ADMA-induced endothelial dysfunction, which has been described in HIV patients, which refers to asymmetric dimethyl arginine. And there are also there have been proposals regarding genetic and autoimmune causes of this pulmonary hypertension. So going into treatment of the pulmonary hypertension, the effect of CCPs has been proven, but the usefulness is very less compared to non-HIV patients. Only in some patients it works, and that too because of the interaction between the ART and CCB. The dosage of CCBs are to be limited, and bosentan has been found to be useful, but one thing is the dose reduction is mandatory. When compared to a normal regimen, the bosentan regimen, which is useful, which are used in HIV patients, are 62.5 milligram per day, either per day or on alternate days. And the efficacy of endothelial receptor antagonists and PDE5 inhibitors are not proven, but there are some studies regarding the efficacy of sildenafil in this patient. But one concern regarding sildenafil is that sildenafil is again found to have a cytochrome oxidase interaction. So whenever protease inhibitors are used, this has to be taken into account. And a word about LV systolic dysfunction. Various causes like MI, increased HSCRP, and current smoking are found to contribute variably to the increased LV systolic dysfunction in these patients. And compared to non-HIV patient, it has also been found that LVH is more. So a regular echo at baseline and every 1 to 2 yearly is mandatory in HIV patients, and BMP levels can also be useful. And actually various causes of this LV systolic dysfunction has been proposed, namely because of the increased usage of drugs, either ART or non-ART regimens, or increased drug abuse, namely cocaine, or increased use of interferon for viral illnesses. And the various opportunistic infection can also contribute to the increased prevalence of LV dysfunction. And various metabolic parameters like selenium deficiency, carnitine deficiency, and electrolyte disturbances, and growth hormone and thyroid hormone disturbances have also been found to contribute variably to the LV systolic dysfunction, which has been found. And as we have seen, the HIV per se has an increased inflammatory milieu in the blood, being contributed by increased TGF alpha, TNF beta, and endothelin 1. So all these can alter the overall milieu towards an inflammatory thing, which in turn can cause the increased LV dysfunction seen in these patients. And selenium deficiency actually is being contributed. It actually increases the virulence of Coxsackie viruses. So it has been found that there are some case reports that selenium replacement might help in this patient. But per se, once LV systolic dysfunction develops, the treatment is just like any other LV dysfunction, just like beta blocker ACE inhibitor. It can mean any other guidelines of heart failure can be followed in HIV patients also. A word about sudden cardiac death. It has been found that sudden cardiac death has been found to be 4.5 times more common in HIV, and the factors contributing being previous MI, old age, heart failure, cardiomyopathies, and arrhythmias. One particular thing is, especially in HIV and hepatitis C co-infected patients, the QT prolongation is very common, and it has also been found to be associated with an increased prevalence of torsades de pointes, and sudden cardiac death is also contributed by this in these patients. And hepatitis C is also found to be an independent factor associated with QT prolongation. That's it. Thank you. Hello? Hello?
Hello, Praveen. Nice presentation. Thank you.
Yeah.
This Braunwald.
Yeah, actually, this is Braunwald only. But what I found was, in last edition of Braunwald, so many extra things were given, man. But in this edition of Braunwald, they have taken out everything, like infective endocarditis, pericardial effusion, everything they have taken out. I don't know why they have taken out, but nothing. The whole